Hey, everybody, welcome back to the Productivity Playground, the podcast where creativity meets efficiency. I'm Justin Draeger.
I'm Tim Maggio.
Hey, Tim, good to see you. I know you've been on the road. I've been on the road, so it's good to reconnect via the podcast.
Yeah, good to see you. Justin, so I was traveling recently and I had the weirdest thing happen to me. So I'm going to tell you what happened to me, but then I want to hear maybe what is one of the weirdest things that have happened to you when you've traveled.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I was in a small airport. I won't disclose the location, and I don't have TSA pre-check, which always confuses everybody since I have started traveling so much more, but I always kind of just I risk it. And I'm like,
Okay,
okay,
yeah.
so
You like taking everything off and taking everything out of your suitcase. Go
yeah,
for it.
I like to really live the
Yeah,
process.
right. Okay.
So I'm getting up to the TSA agent and I give him my ID, and there's maybe like five people in line, so it's not busy. And he's looking at my ID. This is my driver's license. I didn't bring a passport this time. And he says to me, he looks at me like deadpan, "Sir, do you know what's wrong with this ID?" And I'm like,
Is it expired?
yeah, well, no, it wasn't expired. Like, I don't know. I was like, can you tell me? He's like, I'll give you a couple guesses. I'm like,
So this
okay.
guy's got literally time to kill.
Yeah. And
This
he
is not
seemed,
Dulles International where there's like
no, where there's
50
like,
minute
you
line
move it.
behind you. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This guy has time to kill and he wants to have some fun. So it
Yeah.
finally gets around to it and he says, he looks up at my ID, he looks at me in the face and he says, he's not as handsome as the guy I'm looking at right now.
Okay.
And I was like, I had two feelings about this. I was like, one, I respect your commitment to this joke. But two, I hate you for giving me like the largest panic attack I've ever had. Because I'm like,
Because you're
how am
like,
I getting home?
yeah, I just want to get home. Right. Um, I do find at the smaller airports, they're definitely like a homier feel.
Yeah.
Yes, definitely have like time to kill, not as stressed as you are. And I don't know about you, but like when I'm leaving, like wherever, like when I'm leaving the DC area, I'm sort of like, I'm not super stressed because I'm like, if I don't get out, I guess I'm sleeping in my own bed tonight.
Right. Yeah,
But when I'm
exactly.
trying to get home, I'm like, I've got no time for your jokes, sir.
Right. My
I just,
hotel reservation is expired.
yeah. And also, I don't want to be here anymore. Like, I am ready to be home. And I also find it like the smaller airports, right? There's also like very few amenities, very few restaurants. And I remember, and they're also like, they also take like as much as he was joking, they also take their jobs like super
Oh yeah.
serious, as if like there's a lot of terrorist activity happening right in the middle of whatever podunk, nothing happening cornfield. And I
Yeah.
remember once I flew into, and I remember it was Kearney, Nebraska, which I took like a transfer, and it was like a prop plane, which I've only taken a handful of prop planes my whole life. Really noisy. And we landed and they took our baggage off. And I went to go grab my baggage because it was like right in front of me. And they were like, no, you have to go wait for it over there. So I walked behind like a screen and they handed the baggage through the screen and then I could grab my bag. But like their
The
commitment to
theater of it.
the commitment to the procedure was on
Spot
point.
on.
Yeah, it was very on point. So I was like, okay, I respect the
You could have been
procedure.
a secret shopper, who knows?
Yeah, I don't know. But I was like, okay, we will respect the procedure. I will salute and I will take my bag and leave. But yeah, well, good. Did you laugh along or were you just like, give me my license so I can
Yeah, I gave
get
like
through
an
this?
awkward laugh, took my license, and just walked
I
through.
think you play along because the power differential is so real. You
I
don't want to
was
give
thinking
up.
about that. Yeah, I was like, if I don't like laugh at this man, like, is he actually gonna like not let me through?
I don't think they understand, like, they haven't had the HR training where it's like, you can't make friends when there's a huge power differential.
Right. When you can impact my
Yes,
freedom.
someone's like, yeah, they can detain you indefinitely. Who knows? I have no idea.
But have you had anything else weird happen to you traveling like that?
I've had so many frustrating things happen. I don't know if anything weird, but I feel like every time I go through TSA, the rules have changed somehow. And
Oh yeah.
obviously, we all just accept. I'm just like, yes, sure, yes, whatever.
Whatever you want.
Yeah,
Just get me through
I
this
tell you
line.
what, really baffled by are the people who don't accept it. And I'm like, don't you know we're all sheep? Just stop. Why are you even resisting at this point? Like, stop. Who's resisting? I don't know what kind of day somebody's had to resist, but I'm like, don't
Right.
even. Just join the we're all being herded at this point. Okay. Well, listen, we're diving into the pitfalls of busyness and power of intentionality, with insights from one of my favorite authors, Arthur Brooks, who coincidentally, I've run into him a number of times on why being busy doesn't always mean being productive. After that, we're going to chat with someone I'm really looking forward to, Liz Gross, a trailblazer in social intelligence and strategy, and cover how data-driven insights can transform the way we work. I want to start with the busyness part, though. So with that, let's jump into recess. Let me start with a question, Tim. You've been traveling a bit, I know, for the last couple of months. How busy do you feel that you've been?
Yeah, the travel definitely makes me feel busy, but you know, I I think about being busy, but not as often as I feel like some people. Actually, like busyness is something that's always been a little bit of a pet peeve with me. Like this culture of busyness that I feel
Mm.
like we're always in.
Yeah, like you feel like it's a status symbol. Like people are trying to humble brag about how busy, crazy busy.
Yeah, it's kind of like asking somebody how are you and they say good and it's like you don't actually want to know how they are. You actually don't want to know how busy somebody is because then it's like competitive. And like what if you're not busy? You tell somebody you're not busy and like are you bragging to them? Are you like must be nice not to be busy?
Yeah, I think there's something legit about like somehow busyness has become sort of a symbol for how, like a status symbol, and people constantly have to like one up each other about how busy they are. And somehow I do think there's like somehow things got flipped around because it used to be like if you used to signal status by the fact that you had leisure time and
Right.
that you have reached a certain level where you were a well-rounded person. You had time for leisure activity, reading, diving into the arts, and like being really well-rounded. Today it feels like that's not it. It's always about hustle and how many different things you have going on and how busy you are. And I don't know, I get tired of that as well a little bit.
Yeah, if you're not plugging into the machine, what are you doing? You're wasting time.
Well, well, that's I think that's it, and Arthur Brooks dives into this a little bit and sort of equates this question about are you too busy, and there's this sort of like maybe there's this, not that we need to make everything efficient, but there's this peak level of, we can't be idle. There's a certain boredom that comes with idleness, but there's this certain level of busyness that you want to reach, and if you exceed that, if you become too busy where you never have time to like rest, recuperate, or pursue hobbies or things that are of interest to you outside of work or other commitments, that you actually become really unhappy. Do you feel like you've ever reached that point?
I don't want to say that I've cracked the code.
Really? No, this is good. If you feel like you've kind of found this balance.
I did, and this is actually why this article really resonated with me because I almost never feel too busy, and I never feel like I have too much leisure time. I don't know if that's the product of having like two very young children, so a lot of like my time is pretty much like committed for. But I also like since I was in college, like once it gets to like 9 p.m. at night, like my brain kind of like turns to mush. And like if I want to do anything productive or anything efficient, like I just can't do it. So like I can do video games, I can do like some TV or something like that, but I have no problem finding leisure time for myself. And I don't feel stressed out about being idle, and I don't feel stressed about like finding things to make myself busy. Like one thing he talked about that I couldn't really resonate with was, and I think you just talked about it, was being busy is like a way to hide from our own thoughts.
Idleness aversion.
Yeah, and I couldn't grasp that concept.
Well, I do think there's something about, so at work sometimes I think people feel, particularly as you move up in your career, there's something about equating busyness with productivity. And we've tackled this with a couple different
Mm,
of our guests sometimes, which is like you equate this idea that if you're just sort of being idle with your thoughts, being strategic, that somehow you're not being productive because you can't
mm.
necessarily gauge that productivity. And so in the article, Brooks points out that many of us, or a lot of people, maybe not Tim, but many of us avoid free time because we fear that when we are being idle or when we are being alone with our thoughts, it's not necessarily productive. And in that way, or we put such a low value on rest or recuperation, not realizing that that is actually leading to sustainment. Like that's what's actually making us more productive. And so we place low value on that. So some signs that you are idle, you have idleness aversion is like if you find yourself alone, do you dive into low value productive work, or do you call someone, or do you roam the halls looking for a meeting, or are you constantly looking to fill your time with other things? And I guess you're saying that's not you though. You're comfortable with that.
No, I'm comfortable with that. The thing that you said that does resonate with me is like if I feel like other people are busy and I'm not feeling as busy, I'm feeling like I'm not at the same, like I need to kind of match their energy in some way, so I can resonate with that. But if I'm not affected by it, I'm very much affected by other people's energy. So if I'm not around that energy and I have that idle time, then like I'll just kind of take some time to step back and think, what am I focusing on? What needs my attention right now? And I'll kind of think through that for a little bit, and just move on to whatever is kind of a priority for me. But it doesn't like affect me in a way where I'm like looking for it. I kind of like give myself the time for it to almost find me, if that makes sense.
It does make sense. I think Brooks points out in the article a couple suggestions, which is, there's like a certain number of hours, and I think it's probably different for every person. I think in the article, do you remember he kind of points out like it's like 8 or 9 hours? Yeah,
Oh,
okay.
the 9.5 hours per week or something. Yeah.
Yeah, and sort of this idea that one, it's a good idea to like wall off a certain number of hours every day that you can sort of be idle or have creative space. And I actually do try to practice this, although it's not always successful, where I try to every day have like this time where I can be just creative and dive into, and I have a list of things. If you're doing the Eisenhower matrix, right, which is like
Mm,
important, not important, urgent, not urgent, it's that one quadrant that's important, not urgent. That's where I feel like really successful people live if they can
mm,
tackle those things. I have a list of things that I always have that are in that quadrant. And if you find yourself with nothing to do, it's like it's a good idea to like flip to that quadrant, important, not urgent, because the people who can cross things off that list, I feel like really sort of move the ball down the field in their
yeah.
personal lives or their professional lives. Because the urgent stuff you get done or you get fired.
A way that he like said it too that was really similar to that is like he worked with like a consultant or something like that where he had a list of 20 things he had to get done the next day. She said, okay, now pick 10. And then they eventually like whittled it down to 5. And she was like, do those 5 things. And he was like, well, what about the other 15? She's like, just don't do them. Like they won't matter. Like nobody's going to notice because those other 5 things were so awesome.
Yeah, Marissa Mayer, one of the founders of, lead engineer at Google, and then went over to took over Yahoo before it was spun out. Same sort of thing. Like she had a to-do list, but on that to-do list, her goal was never to get it all done. It was like pick the top 3 things. Those are the things you get done. And it was sort of like let the rest go. Same sort of
Right.
thing. Like I have a never-ending to-do list, but what are the things that have to get done that day? And everything else you can sort of let go. It's a nice way to live your life.
Yeah, yeah. I thought it was really interesting too. Is like what they kind of pointed out too was like major things at Google were founded because of this like 20% of staff time they give back for creative thought, like Gmail, Google Earth, like all these really impactful products that many of us use in our daily life were just because the company decided to invest in creative like downtime.
And that's the Perino principle or the 80-20 principle, which is like the 20% of things they did in their creative time produce 80% of the revenue of the company, or 80% of what it's known for today is the stuff that they developed in the 20% of their free time. So big results come from that small percentage of time that they devoted to like just sort of free wielding creativity. All right. I think that's all we've got for recess today. I'm really excited to jump into the sandbox. So let's head over. Joining us today is Liz Gross, someone I've known for a really long time. She jumped out on her own, jumping from a college and university to a social intelligence pioneer And the founder of Campus Sonar, Liz has spent 15 years helping higher education leaders turn data into actionable strategies. She's an award-winning speaker. She's an author. She's really a true expert in the field. Liz, I'm really glad to have you join us today. What I really want to talk to you about, Liz, is like, if I'm being selfish here, I want to talk to you about like social media use, because I feel like, I came from being a CEO and now I'm like a senior executive at another place still in the higher ed space. I feel like I'm just floundering out here and I don't get social media. I really don't. Like I work, Tim helps me sometimes and I try to work with it. And I've followed you in your career and you help leaders with authenticity, I think is part of this equation. But authentically, sometimes I just feel like to hell with it. And sometimes I feel like I don't want to engage on social media. And I read some of it and I feel like, are these really these people's authentic selves sometimes? And okay, unpack all that and define social intelligence and what it is you all do.
I worked really hard at not interrupting you there.
That was the first thing. This is what makes you a great partner.
The concept that what is available online, whether that's on social media, blogs, forums, the news, whatever, is an always on, organically collected focus group that you can mine for insights either historically or in real time about nearly anything you want to. But I like to think about it in terms of audiences, markets, and brands. And that's how we tend to work on it. When I chat with folks about it, usually the first thing they get to is, oh, it's a social media thing. And since I don't do social media, I don't have to worry about this. Or social media is a dumpster fire. I don't want to dive into it. Like, let's go away. That's not what everybody says. But when it's a misunderstanding, that tends to be the case.
That's the misunderstanding. That's the vibe.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So social intelligence works even if the institution is not on social media, if the leader is not on social media, because people are talking about a thing no matter what. And that's what we find. If the institution or the person is having a conversation online, we will do an owned versus earned analysis. And then we can start looking for alignment. And are people actually talking about the things that you think they're talking about? Are you in sync? Those sorts of things. But we will often go look at an audience or a market, not wanting to know necessarily how our client is showing up in that space, but wanting to learn how do people feel, how are they acting, what are they thinking, what are they confused about. And I love to go to places like Reddit to find that out. And that's another misconception people will have is, well, Reddit is just where people go from their parents' basement to complain about whatever. But for the elder millennials in this conversation, we know that Reddit is fast growing the younger you go down the generation chart. And it's something like, it's more than a person under 29 is more than 10 times likely to use Reddit than someone over the age of 55. So there's just a huge generational gap there. And it's where people are going to ease their confusion, find people who have experienced something like that. Like the number of times I've gone to Reddit for things related to like medical issues, whether it's for myself or my family, is wild. So if you think about, would people actually respond to those sorts of prompts in a one-to-one interview or in an online survey? Or is it better to find out what they're trying to learn from strangers on the internet or what advice is being given to them? That's what we're getting at on social intelligence.
I was gonna say that makes a lot of sense because I'll Google stuff sometimes and then I'll add to the end of my Google search Reddit. So that way I get Reddit discussion posts as my answers.
And if anyone ever wants to know the ROI of Reddit, that is how I got Taylor Swift tickets at face value. So just saying.
And so you can quantify it and it's pretty valuable.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so let me try to put this another way, just so we can stay on and mind your great, all that you're bringing to the table here before we dive into like the creativity and the productivity aspects of all this. So let's say take me in my role. Let's say I don't engage. I'm a leader who doesn't engage in any way in social media. There's still an aspect of social intelligence that comes into play here because I might still have a brand, or the organization I have will still have a brand, whether or not I'm engaging in social media in any way, and understanding what that brand is or how people perceive me or that brand. Going back to how we started, if I'm out there just using a pen and a flip chart to talk about my topic, that's giving off some sort of brand. And understanding what people think about that brand still requires social intelligence.
Right. And that could be working. And we would potentially find that in social intelligence. But it's a way for you to get out of your bubble from whether it's good or bad that people are giving you real time feedback on to see what else is out there. And often a way to get data where you've sometimes relied on gut feelings. It's like one of the big things we use social intelligence for with our clients is to answer the very basic question, is this thing a big deal? And it's hard to know that until you take a 30,000-foot view of what's happening, not just within your circle, but outside of it.
Do you ever tell, is your advice to someone individually who's talking about their personal brand or their institution or their organization or company, is your advice ever don't engage on social media? Like you shouldn't have a social media strategy or it's not helpful to you?
Well, I nodded my head, which listeners don't know, because we often our advice is shut your mouth. Do not respond to this thing. You do not need to add to this particular conversation. And those are often the most high value things we do for our clients. We help them know when to to stay out of their own way, but they don't really work into case studies because no one wants to know what they didn't talk about.
Right.
But in terms of ever giving someone the advice of should you not be on social media, we have definitely told folks like, you do not need to be on this network, or you're trying to accomplish this goal here. It's never going to happen. So either get off of it or shift your strategy. That actually absolutely comes up all the time.
That makes sense. So you're sitting down with somebody and you're saying, what's your goal, first of all? And then as we figure out your goal, it's a mapping like where they are and then where they want to be, and then trying to figure out some sort of, I assume, mapping how they potentially could get there. And so maybe that starts tying into some of the questions that I have for you, which is not only what you do and what your company brings to the table, but sort of the stakeholder engagement that you do. So how do leaders that you work with use all of this to enhance like their productivity, their creativity? How does all that come into play?
Yeah, I like to think of a lot of what we're doing, particularly in stakeholder engagement. We're trying to learn about an audience as a category. So prospective students or alumni or donors, whatever that might be. I think about our ability to provide cheat codes to how to authentically communicate with that audience, whether it's where to communicate with them, when to communicate with them, or what to communicate with them about. And that is something that we can do fairly quickly. And we can go back in time like as of today and figure out trends from the past without having to wait 3 years to gather all that trends data. So it's also a time cheat code, a bit of a time machine to be able to do that. And sometimes when individual engagement is really high stakes, for example, in advancement or fundraising, we can target that to an individual based on what their network looks like, who they're engaging with, and don't just go, hey, would you like to donate $1 million? You can know this is what they're interested in. This is who they're most likely to listen to. Let's target that ask based on what we've learned in social intelligence. So it can be at scale or in the right situations, one-to-one.
So when you're thinking about engaging those stakeholder experiences and you're taking into account this social intelligence and putting it, aligning it with a strategy, how do you balance the data that you're talking about, and some of it's real time, with the authenticity and human touch side? I find that it's really hard to translate that across different mediums, particularly, I'm personally, I feel pretty good in person. I can even do it across Zoom where I'm talking to people, podcasting, maybe even a little bit. But social media to me feels like a very tough medium to convey authenticity or human touch.
Are you an extrovert or an introvert, Justin?
People won't believe this, and I feel like it's the fad thing to say nowadays, but I feel like I'm probably close, but more introverted than extroverted because I like to have my alone time and that's how I recharge. But I like human connection. I like to be with people, but I
Well,
need to.
introverts don't hate people.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Well, then maybe I'm dealing with like the branding of an only child. But I like to be. I like my alone time, and that's how I
Yeah,
recharge.
I asked because I actually find it sometimes easier to be authentic and engaging online because I have the time to reflect on what it is I'm going to say
Hmm.
versus like whatever's just going to fall out of my mouth in person or on a podcast interview. But I think that's also a bit generational too. Like I was using social media professionally from the age of 22, and that's how I learned to communicate with folks professionally. But I've totally veered us away from your question, which was something,
No.
oh,
No.
how does the
No.
data and
No.
authenticity?
No. No. Let's go back to that for a second.
Okay.
I want to keep going going with that. I think there is something generational there, Liz. And I wonder, how do you advise? Because I imagine a lot of the leadership that you're working with is generationally distant, maybe from, you may have described yourself as an elder millennial.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so here I am, a younger Gen X. And if you're dealing with me and above, age wise, how do you help us? Who, I think that's part of it. Like, I did not grow up with this medium, and it's tough. Like, I find it tough to authentically say anything of value or human relationally valuable through social media.
Yeah. I want to cite a source, which is a good friend of mine, but also a scholar in this area, Josie Alquist, who has a digital leadership book. She walks folks through like how to be authentic and a leader online if you know nothing about social media. It's an amazing book. But it all comes down to like values and goals. What do you want to achieve and who are you and does it make sense to be here? But in our work at Campus Sonar, we are very, very infrequently advising a leader or an institution on like what should you say in this particular instance or how should you show up on this particular place in social media. We're more thinking holistically in terms of communication as a brand or as an organization or supporting a leader's vision. How can we help you understand the themes as well as the community response and everything that we're seeing so that you can communicate in the places where you're comfortable and hopefully where your audiences are and some little bit of overlap there. But if it's not the place that the leader wants to be, we've never, ever pushed someone to be there. There are multiple models for leadership social media. Some of them are literally, like having someone else do it for you that you trust a lot. Some are to not be there. I named these all at one time, but I don't remember the cool sports related metaphors I had for all of them. I don't think every leader needs to be online. I think if they are online and using social media, they should feel somewhat confident that they know why they're there and what it's doing. And if not, there are other ways to communicate. I grew up with it and it just makes sense to me.
Okay, Liz, I have another question for you. Then we're going to get back to the stuff at hand. I feel like
Mm.
I'm getting a free session here, so I'm going to just
Tim has
exploit it.
no idea what's happening.
Here's part of my generational wonder, but I do find that Gen X's tend to be a little bit more sarcastic. That doesn't translate super well on social, does it? So is there any room for any of that on LinkedIn? Like, it just doesn't translate, right?
You
I find that
specifically on
LinkedIn
LinkedIn.
is like, we all have to be positive. We all have to love work. Work is life. That's what I see on
I
LinkedIn.
don't know. My last LinkedIn post was I am exhausted.
And how many did that get? A lot of engagement?
Yeah, a ton. Everyone else was
Really?
exhausted too. I think there is a way.
LinkedIn feels very Orwellian to me. It feels like we're all living in 1984 sometimes. Like, sometimes it feels very authentic, and other times I'm like, are we all living in George Orwell's 1984? Work is work. What was it? It was double speak, but I can't remember exactly what it was. But it's something like work is life or something.
I read that book in like 2017 and the timing was just terrifying for me.
Yeah, I understand.
So I'm like, oh yeah, I was there. I tried to put it out of my mind. I think you can be sarcastic in online spaces, but there are ways to indicate it. Like if I was going to be really sarcastic, I would then do like the open bracket sarcasm, close bracket, just so folks
To
know.
be super clear.
But also know it could always be taken out of context. So like I'll only go so far with
Yeah.
that sarcasm. There's also a risk tolerance factor there, and I think my risk tolerance on social media as an individual is much higher than a lot of people's, and I'm not advising that people should match me there.
Well, I think this is why I'm so much comfortable in a spoken medium, because there I can make my intent, I feel like, a little more known and apparent. And this is why I struggle in social media, because I feel like maybe it's also, I have a thinner skin around trolling, where you're advising leaders, you don't need to engage in that sort of stuff. You put out there what you're going to put out there and have the social intelligence to know where to engage and where not to engage.
Liz, I wonder if it's kind of also like a frequency thing too, right? Like if you're like posting like once a month and then like out of the blue a sarcastic post comes up, it's like, okay, what's this about? But if you're like kind of cultivating a brand and you're maybe posting weekly, then maybe that risk it lowers. Would you say that's true or no?
Yeah, because then you build up more expectations of who you are and you've got a bit of a persona there, whether it's contrived or authentic, whatever it is, then I think that makes a lot more sense. And there's something to be said about being able, I think, especially on LinkedIn, to have real personal conversations there in a somewhat public space. I haven't done like an in-depth actual study on this, but just looking at what people actually engage with when I post on LinkedIn. And it's sadly maybe been one of my favorite social networks for years and years and years.
Well, I don't, why do you say sadly? I don't think it's sad. The thing that LinkedIn has going for it is that everybody's who they say they are mostly, right?
That's true. Yeah.
That's a good thing.
And I've just like always been really nerdy about my work. So it's been okay for like, I'm like, oh, I can be here and talk about things I'm legitimately very excited about because that's what this place is for. But I've noticed that particularly as, you know, as a business leader, if I am regularly posting things that are just links to even if they're really great articles or links to anything that is viewed as remotely promotional, it does not go very anymore at all. But if I actually just post what I'm thinking about and ask people to join a conversation and do it in a way that's not smarmy, like those 1984, like everyone's got the cheat codes for how to love your job forever. That's where people engage. And that's where I actually have more connections come from those posts. The number of people who followed me in the last 4 days because I wrote about how exhausted I was and what I was going to do to continue to be an engaged, and we'll bring it back to your podcast topic, productive leader.
Yeah.
While not being continually exhausted. Like that was something people wanted to talk about. They didn't want to read my latest case study.
All right. So let's go back to the balancing data and human touch part though, because it feels like there's an art and a science to what you're doing and how you advise folks.
Absolutely. At its core, what we do is qualitative research. So what I would say is not just the data and the human touch, but the data and the context in which we are collecting it, receiving it, and applying it is where it really matters. So we can do really great work because we work within a single industry and we know the context of how people talk in this industry, how the various strategies that folks are going to employ based on the information that is put in front of them. And we can use that to say, you know, here are some things you might want to consider. And here's how we've seen it play out at other institutions. Here's something you might want to do. It's going to be the first time that we're aware of that anybody has done this. I think that context is more where the authenticity comes into what we're sharing. It's more of here's what the data says and why we think it should go this way or that way based on what we've seen for 7 years trying to see everything we can online about higher education.
Yeah. Ultimately, though, you're using data to kind of show you some past trends, and then you're leaning into what sounds like sort of a gut feeling about where things might go in the future. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's an informed gut feeling. Yeah.
Okay.
And we can't just trust the data as it gets spit out of the tool. If you wanted to do a whole other interview on my thoughts on AI in this field, it's scary what AI tries to do in terms of social listening and social intelligence, and not in a good way. We've seen it send conclusions down a really bad path. And for things like sentiment or like what's actually mattering in a conversation, it needs a human to look at it and just give it that litmus test of, does this make sense on its face? A perfect example is there was someone who was an athlete at an institution we were analyzing. Their last name was Fails. And every time they were a very good athlete. So there's just all this negative sentiment about the institution because of this poor guy's last name. And that's a low stakes shift. But I would not rely on AI to get the full nuance of what's happening in these spaces. And I know you love AI, so that's a whole other conversation.
Well, I love AI for some things. I should be clear on that. Not for all things. So I'm definitely very humble about where it's falling short. So I'm open to those conversations. Liz, we asked this of every guest on this show. Well, before I get to that, what practical advice would you give? What is this, the practical advice about someone who's new to this field? Or
Yeah.
Okay, someone that's new to this field, Liz, what's the most productive first step? What practical advice do you have for them?
I like that you said the most productive first step, because the thing with social listening and social intelligence, you can get in the weeds really, really, really quickly and get frustrated and confused. So through the art of shameless self-promotion, I would say look at what social listening research can offer at scale. And if listeners care about higher education at all, which they probably do if they chose this episode, I'd recommend taking a look at our Rebuilding Public Trust in Higher Education Social Intelligence report, because we don't talk about social media in that report at all. It is about human perception of an industry And that is the power of social intelligence. So look at a high level application before like logging onto Reddit and searching for something you're interested in, which can also be fun, but can be very frustrating.
Very helpful. Liz, we ask this of every guest. What's one productivity hack you swear by that helps you stay focused and manage your work, which as an entrepreneur, a business leader, has to be immense. So what is it? What's the one secret you swear by?
Kind of funny because we talked about my LinkedIn posts about exhaustion, but my hack is to rest and to turn it off. When people start working with me for the first time, they're often very surprised about the fact that when I walk away from my desk in the evening at a very normal hour, usually 5:30, I don't have notifications turned on for any of my work apps or anything like that. And I don't look at it again until the next day when I decide that it is time for that to happen. And I also prioritize like taking time off and blocking my calendar when things absolutely have to get done this week. So I have learned in some ways through hard ways that you have to put yourself first or you are not going to be able to be there for the company and for everybody else. So the second part of the post about exhaustion was how many days off I'm going to have for the next rest of this year, which is a number I'm continually looking at.
Good for you, Liz. I always remind myself, you've got to take care of the machine and nobody else will. That's a primarily you responsibility. Good for
And
you.
you're not productive when you're tired or exhausted.
Yeah, you're actually losing efficiency, probably taking longer to get things done that you would have otherwise been able to tear through maybe a lot faster. It's been a pleasure to talking to you and catching up again. I feel like it's been a
Yeah,
long time since I've been able to chat with you in the Dells, Wisconsin. So, are you still in Wisconsin?
I am. I
Oh,
say I
okay.
live in the cornfields outside of Madison.
Liz Gross, it's been a pleasure to catch up with you and talk to you about where productivity meets creativity. And thanks so much for sharing so much about what you're doing to help industry leaders find their authentic voice and exercise social intelligence.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for listening to the Productivity Playground podcast. Now, before you get back to your to-do list, go ahead and drop us a follow on LinkedIn or Instagram at Productivity Playground Podcast. Thanks so much to Liz Gross for joining us, and make sure you give her a follow on LinkedIn and check out Campus Sonar and all the great work they're doing. Thanks again for joining us, Liz.